Hi, everyone. This is the September 2nd, 2020 meeting of sig-auth. The first item on the agenda is the multi-tenancy benchmark. Jim, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
So let me, do you have something to share, or would you like me
Yeah,
to?
absolutely. I can share my screen. Would like to show a quick demo.
Cool.
Yeah, I think if you stop sharing,
If I
or
stop
maybe I
sharing,
can
you'll...
just, oh, oh, that let me go through. Okay. All right. So I think we had discussed this project maybe a month or two ago in one of our SIG meetings, but just for quick recap of what we're doing in the multi-tenancy benchmarks project. So this is one of the tracks in the multi-tenancy working group. So what we started seeing is there's, of course, increasing number of different ways to address enterprise type multi-tenancy, right? So this is different teams sharing a cluster, um, and for various reasons, of course, and most of these will build around namespaces, right? But one of the challenges that came up, I think, at a prior KubeCon and what we've been discussing and addressing in this track is how do you measure if namespaces are properly configured for multi-tenancy, and then sort of broadening it to other aspects of the cluster configuration as well, right? So the intent was to create a set of benchmarks where we could measure configuration settings and test and validate configuration settings for multi-tenancy. And that's what this benchmark efforts does. So if you go to the multi-tenancy group, you go to benchmarks, there is a subfolder kubectl MTB. And I'm going to talk about this specific project, and we're going to move that up to the main folder and replace some of the contents here. And what we've done previously is we had kind of identified about 15 or so different checks, and which we would go through for our namespace. And the focus of this kubectl MTB, and we worked with a Google Summer of Code intern, Anuj, who's on the call as well as Divya, who was a community bridge intern, and they've mostly developed this tool, working with our working group. And what I'm going to demonstrate today is what this does and how it helps in terms of this multi-tenancy measurement, right? So feel free to browse and look at this folder, but what I'll do is I'll just share what this looks like in if you're kind of, just building this to a cluster. So the builder tool, you just kind of run make kubectl mtb, and I already have that done. So what I'm going to do is if on my cluster over here, if I just look at the namespaces, what I'll do is I'll create a new namespace. And whoops, so I want to say create namespace test. And what I'm going to do is I want to run this benchmark on that namespace. But we also need a particular role to run this as. So I'm going to use a namespace admin role, right? So the recommendation is you run this either as a namespace admin or as a namespace edit type of user. So I'm going to say create a role, and I have this in one of my folders. So we'll just install some role bindings. So this put in a role Ali, who's an admin, and Edith, who is a edit user in that namespace, right? So now if I run, and prior to this, I guess if I wanted to build, I would just do make kubectl mtb, but I already have this built. So if I just do kubectl mtb, and this works as a kubectl plugin, or it will, be just a standalone command. What we want to do is we want to say run, or if I do, for example, get, it'll show me the list of benchmarks available. So these are the 16 or so checks we have currently implemented. And they cover different things like host isolation, with the namespace isolation, as well as different self-service operations. But what we really want to do over here is we just want to say run. We want to say minus n for the namespace, which I'll use the namespace I just created. And I'm gonna then say, as the user, Ali, who's the admin of the namespace, right? So now, since I haven't configured this namespace with any security policies or any multi-tenancy, any type of policy engine, a lot of these things are going to fail. Some may pass just because of standard RBAC, right? So you see the report over here, most of the checks failed, right? So on what we've done for testing and just going back up to the repo, and if you go through the README, we've implemented these checks with now also with Kyverno as well as OPA Gatekeeper. So these are two policy engines that we have tested with. And what you can do for this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to install Kyverno policies, which will help us with getting these checks to pass, right? So going back to the shell, I'm just going to run this command, which installs the Kyverno policies. And the reason why I'm using Kyverno is just Gatekeeper takes a little bit longer to, once. So we want these to be installed. So let's see, and let me make sure I have Kyverno running. Yep, seems to be okay. And so now if we do run, with this user, what we would expect to see is some of these, more of these tests to pass, right? So that's where it's going to go through, run the checks. And what we're actually doing in these checks is just using dry run and, the Go client. We're able to, whoops, it seems like that's running into some errors. Yeah, I'll have to check and see why it's running into errors, but the expected result would have been once you install the policies and you have the latest, benchmarks, it would come back and it would show these as successful, right? So, and that's where, the idea is to report back and show success for these particular users. So just, I think what, oh, yeah, so Anuj is messaging and saying there was a role binding error, so maybe I configured that wrong. Thanks, Anuj. Let's try that again. Did I, oh, maybe I didn't, oh, right. So I didn't put that in the namespace. Let's try that one more time. So now if I run the tests where I'm running in that, in the right namespace as that user, we should be able to see hopefully more success. And it seems like it's taking a bit longer, which is a good sign. So yeah, we see more passes and there are a few failures expected because there's some tests which we are not 100% sure how to handle exactly. We're working with some different frameworks to figure out. But as you see over here, most of the tests pass. The one which shows an error, there's, for example, some resources, if you create like a default network policy within the namespace, we're still debating how do you identify that that's a resource created by an admin, a cluster admin, and should not be deleted by the namespace admin. So the thinking there is to have some standard label selectors we could introduce or some labels on that resource, and then we would check for that. The other one, this namespace, since I just created it, I don't have resource quotas configured. So if I configure that correctly, these two checks will pass as well. So that's the general idea. This also produces, if I kind of change the output to a policy report. So one of the other working groups, the policy working groups, is working on a standard policy report format. So this tool, MTB, has the capability of generating a policy report, which becomes available in your cluster, which you can then collect as a Kubernetes resource and report externally as well. So that's what we wanted to show. And really what we're looking for here is thoughts on next steps. If anyone from the SIG wants to help, in terms of firming up, auditing, and, kind of validating that these are the right checks. And also helping, so far we've been focused mostly on level 1 checks. where we're looking at single namespaces. We want to extend this to multiple namespaces that a tenant or that a particular team within an enterprise may own. And how do we validate that they have proper configurations even across multiple namespaces? So let me pause there, see if there's any questions, thoughts, feedback, or just in general, and what folks think.
How do you define the benchmarks?
Yes, so it is very configurable, and I'll show you just quickly. Let me see if I have this up in, yeah. So the benchmarks themselves, and if we go here to test benchmarks, we can take a look at what one of them looks like. What the Nuge and Divya have done is they've created a way to kind of standardize, so you can define some set of, like a YAML for the benchmark, and this will automatically generate the README and also some scaffolding for the test cases, right? So then the idea is that for each benchmark, you would implement a test. And here, this benchmark is, checking whether a namespace admin has access to kube system, things like that. So you can just implement the test using, client Go and other utilities that you want to perform, right? So, and most of this we're able to do just through dry run commands, right? So for example, if you want to check for a pod and make sure that it can't add capabilities, you can, try to, once you install the policies to block that, you would just do a dry run and check for the status.
Yeah, it seems really cool. I think I would like to review what the benchmarks are so far, and maybe you can crowdsource additional benchmarks or modification. I think it's always good to get some general broad consensus that these are the right things to check for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we've seen some stuff in the CIS that was kind of questionable, and there's probably stuff missing
Right.
if you look hard enough. The other thing is the kube control plugin. I think is pretty cool, but some sort of continuous scanning would
Right.
also be useful.
Yes. Yeah, so there what we're thinking is we could run the same CLI as, as a job or as a cron job, and it could produce this policy CRs. Or perhaps we have we could even, and one challenge is then if there's some cleanup and other things required after. So far we've been able to write most of the benchmarks where there's no cleanup required, but if there's some cleanup required, we might need a controller or to run these in through a controller.
Yeah, it is slightly unfortunate that in order to scan all namespaces, you would need to know specific users that have access in that namespace, and you would also need to have basically a full access cluster admin to the cluster. But I don't see an obvious way to
You could
get around
inspect
that.
the role bindings and guess who's cluster admin, but that doesn't tell you anything about whether or not that particular namespace admin is supposed to be namespace admin, only that they effectively are within certain
Right.
heuristics.
Right.
That is that is one way to do it.
I didn't say it was a good way.
Yeah, assuming RBAC is being used. The other thing is these things like block privileged containers do require a dry run because you really have no idea what is actually enforcing that.
Yeah, so we wanted to keep this as agnostic as possible of both of the enforcement and of the way to configure namespaces, but that does introduce some challenges where there's a little bit of configuration required, right? So maybe that could be, I guess, if a cluster admin gives us some hints or indicates what their expectations are of multi-tenancy, then we can even take that as an input and run the scans accordingly.
I do really like, though, that black box assessment kind of approach where it's not, we only support, say, gatekeeper and we inspect your policies, but rather it's, we try doing things someone could try and we report on the success or failure of it because, yeah, everyone has different reasons to choose different tools.
Yeah, there's so many ways to configure authorizers and admission.
Right. Yeah, and we wanted to make this useful even if somebody manually configures a namespace, right? Just to make sure that they have the done the right things. At least this gives some guidelines and feedback.
Yeah, when Mike was asking about like which checks we were doing, the one that came to mind was the stuff that Tim has been working on defining around the different pod security profiles. Like, so if you wanted to say like this namespace is constrained to this profile, then you could check those things. So this seems like a friendly way to do those checks, and it is behavioral instead of like, depending on a particular mechanism.
Right.
Is there such a thing as a meta test in here where if you had individual tests for each of the properties, say in the pod security standards, then also could you have a meta test that said, you know, based on these n checks, you know, pods in this namespace are constrained to the restricted policy from the upstream pod security standards versus this namespace has the base one versus, you know, this namespace is unconstrained?
Not currently. So the way we have structured the tests is we have different profile levels, and the thinking was profile level, the base profile level is just you have standalone namespaces. Profile level 2 introduces more like self-service across, so things like that, you know, with HNC, which is the hierarchical network controller or namespace controller, which allows, you know, admins to manage multiple namespaces. We would enable those, and profile level 3 is where you go to a full, you know, virtual cluster model where you have different API servers, which is what there's another project in the working group which is attempting to do that. So that's how we're structured today, but I like the idea of, you know, having more, you know, either through namespace labels or some other mechanisms, being able to group and run and skip the test accordingly, right? So this is, yeah, right now we have these tests group defined. It's both on our GitHub page as well as, you know, in this document, and we'll continue sort of refining these and expanding the tests. We want to add like some storage tests, which are fairly more involved and complex with PBCs, but some of those are important to do. And, you know, so definitely would love to team up with folks who are interested and you know, get some more feedback on whether these tests are correct, and we now have all the tools in place to quickly add more tests and structure as needed.
Yeah, just to follow up on what some other folks have already said. One of the things we talked about for the pod security standards was building some sort of test that could run those and see if a particular cluster or namespace or something was conforming to one of those profile levels. And this seems like a really natural fit for that goal. Yeah, it would be cool if we could, I don't know if all of those checks are in here already. If any are missing, it would be a good addition. But also some way, kind of what we were just talking about, but like if there was like a concept of a test suite or a test group or something like that, where you could say, I'm interested in the, you know, pod restricted tests. Tell me if I meet that bar.
Exactly, or if we can correlate, you know, multi-tenancy level to, you know, one of the pod security levels, right, then it just becomes easier, right, to maintain that mapping and say, okay, for this level, you need pod security level 2 or however that's defined, right? So.
Yeah, and then I guess also if we could run directly against one of those profile levels, we could definitely add a link to the tool from that page and say,
Okay.
to see if you're meeting this profile or to test against this profile level, we recommend this tool. Get some more visibility to it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll reach out, on that, and I'll also send more information, and I can add that to the agenda as well for where we have some of these profile levels defined. I haven't read up on the latest on the profile levels, but I'll do that, and we can discuss what it would take to do that mapping.
Related to a couple of those points from earlier, and about whether the tests are the right tests, and also just from a natural providing something that people are going to want or need. If you could create various test suites that corresponded to compliance with various sorts of compliance regimes, like, for example, if you could have all of the parts that make sense for your tool of the CIS benchmark in a prepackaged form, because that's going to be a natural place where people are going to want to measure. And so, if it came out of the box, then that would be a reason that people would want to come and use it. And then for a certain definition of right, it would also let you know that you were doing the right tests.
Okay. Yeah, so map it
right,
to
at least meaning things people want
Right.
to test. There's
Yeah.
the further question of, are the things in dollar compliance benchmark right? But that's kind of outside of your scope.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that
Because
makes
otherwise
sense.
you're kind of accidentally creating your own compliance benchmark.
Right. No, our focus here was really more related to multi-tenancy, but yes, we can, kind of figure out how to extend it to at least have some mapping to say that this rule will address which compliance standards or allow that to be configured somehow.
As a thing in case people care, because
Right.
they frequently do.
Yes.
A lot of
Okay.
people have both requirements. In my experience, people have compliance requirements, and people want to run big multi-tenant clusters. Maybe they might be separate people. They might be the security team and the cluster operators, but there's definitely some intersecting concerns there.
Whatever
point,
helps
yeah.
those two groups get along better is.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing, I think we have a brand new SIG security information in the formative phase right now. They are working on some benchmarking stuff, I know, as part of their charter. I think they might be interested in a similar presentation if you have the time.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. A sort of an announcement and scheduling of a first meeting should be going out soon to the probably to Kubernetes dev and Kubernetes security discuss. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay.
I want to throw a link to those in the announcement section of the minutes, Tim.
I'll add it when the announcement goes out, but it hasn't yet.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So less exciting. Next on the agenda, sig-auth, but also important. Jordan, take it away.
Wow, what a What a setup. Who could ask for a better setup than that? You want to let me share my screen? I'll open some of these.
Yeah, sure.
Nobody's excited about CI health until it's keeping their pull requests from merging and making them retest 1 trillion times. Then everybody's excited about it.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Can you see that?
Yep.
All right. So unless you've been hiding under a rock or quarantining with no remote access over the past 6 months, you've probably seen some of the rumblings about CI improvements, and the 119 code freeze was longer than normal, and the merge queue around the time of code freeze was much worse than normal, and there were sort of 3 distinct issues. One was our infrastructure, the sort of tragedy of the commons, like more and more jobs just kept getting added, and more tests got added to those jobs, and consuming more and more resources without really reserving them. And so sometimes they'd run great, sometimes they'd run poorly, and it was just inconsistent. And so a lot of cleanup work was done over the past month to take the jobs that actually block merges or pre-submit jobs, and then the ones that are release blocking, and make them run with reserved resources, and make them run in environments that are only running jobs with reserved resources, so that we take some of the noise out of that signal. So you don't have a test that runs great if it has 3 or 4 CPUs available to it, but then gets starved and flakes if it has half a CPU. And so that work is pretty much complete at this point, which means that now when we see flakes, it's a much better indication that there's problems in the tests themselves or in the things that they're testing. And so we are working with all of the SIG leads and the component owners as we start going through 120 development to build in this cycle of pay attention to your test health, your test coverage, and your test health. And if those things are lacking, then you don't actually really know if what you're shipping is good. And you should prioritize test coverage and test health before you start adding new things or changing existing things. So I've linked to a few different resources. The first one is actually not working at the moment. There's an issue for that. But the triage board is a really good way to get a sense for whether there's an issue across test environments. And so I actually did a training session in SIG testing that we recorded, which is useful and I would recommend. But as part of that, I pulled up the sig-auth filtered view of that triage board. So it's a little small, I apologize. But you can see that prior to a few days ago, there were actually a ton of sig-auth tagged tests that were just failing or flaking constantly. And it turns out that was one that was known to be flaky and kind of got relegated to a flaky suite and then ignored for like a year. And so I was able to go clean that up, and there's like 1 or 2 remaining issues, but basically we now have much better signal. So if we filter the triage board to sig-auth, once this noise like rolls off the history, if we start to see issues, that actually means something now, instead of this sort of low-level background, oh yeah, it's just always flaky, that's just how it is. And so, like I said, we're trying to build this cycle of like regularly, probably on a weekly basis, checking health of the things that are supposed to be testing the components we're shipping. A couple other resources. There's a link to the video that I did. This doesn't tend to be an issue so much for sig-auth tests, which is good. It tends to be more an issue for long-running operations or operations that have to navigate like network drop, reconnect types of things. So API machinery, storage, like some of these longer running operations tend to have issues with flakes. But I just walked through sort of strategies for reproducing and pinning down flaking tests. There's also a link to a pull request that will shortly, hopefully this week, go in, which will change our unit tests from being required to pass 1/3 of the time to requiring them to pass 3 times before merge. And so our unit test pre-submits were basically tolerating up to 2 failures per unit test. And sig-auth did not escape. We actually had a flaky unit test around CSR defaulting. The fuzzer didn't match the defaulting rule, and so it would sometimes fail depending on what random data it put in the certificate API. So even sig-auth isn't doing anything weird timing network based. We had a flake in our unit tests, which is terrible, but it's fixed now. The thing that I wanted maybe to call out more and to point to a specific example of is test coverage gaps. So I think generally the tests that we have in place in sig-auth are stable and reliable and like have a pretty good split between like unit tests, testing a lot of edge cases, and then integration tests, making sure things actually work as you expect when you start them up, and then some EDE tests that make sure that our cluster configuration is reasonable. We do lack test coverage for certain types of tests. The ones that I'm thinking of in particular are scale tests around some of our components. We've seen issues in the past where we had like a token cache or a webhook authenticator. And when you test it functionally, it works great. But actually, if you really, really hammer the API server, you can exhaust resources, or you can make the API server do a lot of work. And so we've identified that in particular places in the past based on sort of bug reports or benchmarks or things like that, and done really targeted fixes. But we don't really have scale tests for all of our components. And so that's a gap that would make sense to at least evaluate and then see which ones make sense to close. The second gap that we have is around upgrade tests. And fortunately, we don't do a lot of things that tend to interact with upgrades. The main one that we exercise regularly is like the default policies, the RBAC policies that are built into the API server. And so we have unit tests around the upgrade scenarios for that, which ensure that when you upgrade, new permissions are only added to existing roles. We never, ever automatically tighten policy on upgrade because upgrade has to be safe. But we have come across a feature, which is the bound token feature, where we are getting to the point where we want to switch which type of token we inject into running pods. Switch it from a secret-based token to a bound token. And that has the potential to be extremely disruptive to running workloads on upgrade. And so I linked to a discussion in the enhancements update around that. I think this is a good example of a place where we really need to prove that this change is safe before we roll it out to open source. And so there's discussion in that issue, and SIG testing is involved as well in trying to find ways for us to run tests like this. But starting to think about that as a category when you're designing a feature, thinking about the rollout of it is important, especially given how fundamental a lot of the things we work on are. If you can't authenticate, it doesn't really matter much else. Like, it doesn't matter how great all the other features work if you can't even make the API calls to exercise them. And then the last thing I wanted to call out was a proposal that Wojtek from Scalability has been working on. This is trying to come up with ways to encourage the project to address issues like this. So making sure that we have things in place to allow for scale and soak and upgrade tests, and then making sure we have good signal to recognize when we have issues in an area, and then the feedback loop of saying if we have failures in a component or a SIG's area, then the only types of changes that should be made in that area are fixing those issues. So we want to slow down like feature merges and changes that are not related to fixing the signal that tells us whether what we have is working. So if you haven't seen that, take a look at that. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure people know about these resources and start to think about them as you work on your individual features, but then also as a SIG, looking at these dashboards a part of our biweekly meeting, probably. That was it.
Awesome, Jordan. Thanks for all the hard work. One question. You mentioned we did have some flaky unit tests. How are our end-to-end tests doing? Or is that pending the fix to test grid or test cluster?
The end-to-end tests, last I looked, ours were fine. The ones I pay attention to the most are sig-auth and sig-API machinery. API machinery has a few like timeout type ones where a controller takes longer than expected in some runs. And so those are a little tricky to pin down, but most of the sig-auth ones are very concrete, whether they pass or fail. It's not so much a timeout type issue. So.
And regarding the upgrade tests, what's the current plan? Are we either implementing in a deprecated suite or waiting a quarter for us to graduate a feature?
My perspective is that getting the existing upgrade suite running again and writing a minimal test around this is probably the quickest way to get coverage. That's probably what I would recommend. Yeah. And the way that suite is written, if it does a pretty good job of separating sort of the upgrade aspect from the functional, like what should the world look like before, what should the world look like after, what are the checks you want to run. So I know SIG testing is working on a way to do upgrade tests that isn't coupled to the kube cluster spin up, which is great. I think that's good. From talking with them, once that's available, moving the existing upgrade tests from the E2E upgrade suite over to that framework doesn't seem like it would be that difficult.
Cool. There are no other questions on that. Let's move on. Does anybody have any announcements? Maybe Tim had one, but looks like he's not on the call anymore. About, I think he was just going to say there's an upcoming inaugural meeting of SIG security. So keep an eye out on the mailing list. And I think there's actually already a SIG security mailing list if you go to
yeah,
Kubernetes
that mailing
repo.
list got created either yesterday or the day before. I don't remember which, but yeah, one can now join the mailing list and Jay is working on an announcement and how to drum up appropriate levels of community support around the kinds of things that they have in their charter.
Awesome. I'll paste the mailing list link into the agenda, and then let's move on to triage. Oh, mailing list.
Yeah, so that first link won't work.
Which one?
The CI flakes, that's the dashboard that's having trouble right now.
Will it work and just download a terabyte of data?
It downloads 500 megabytes and then your browser gets really unhappy trying to parse it. Yay.
Do we not have any tests or what? Just kidding. I
actually think we could probably
integration tests.
We could probably also pull in sig-auth tagged integration tests. So I'm not actually sure where this dashboard is defined, but we do have more tests than this.
I think it might just be in test infra, if I recall, somewhere in a YAML file. Wow, great job, everyone. All right, moving on to issues. Unassigned. I started to look through these last night. Unassigned. So we did not remove support from this query. Let's go through the ones that are not labeled support for now, and then circle back.
Also, I don't know if you've followed the Contribex discussion. There's a the goal is to add a triage or needs triage label like to new issues and new PRs, and I think that will simplify this. You can basically filter it to sig-auth needs triage, and then assign and prioritize. So, we've discussed this one a lot. I don't think there's an owner. I think the person who was most interested in it is not an org member, so they probably can't own it.
Yeah.
I think I would probably tag this as backlog.
I want to help on it. I will throw it in the backlog. Backlog. Not even sure if this is a good idea anymore. Cool. So I looked at this one last night. It was opened a really long time ago, and it first went to sig storage, and went to sig cli, and then went to sig cluster lifecycle, and then API machinery. Oh wait, no, that was me, and then to sig-auth. The original issue is invalid padding on input, which is almost certainly they just changed the storage encryption key, which would cause that to happen. Close it. What do you think?
I haven't looked at the issue to see if they provided more information. If it's reproducible and then this seems like a real issue.
Well, so all right, so the issue mentions AES CBC, which is unauthenticated. We put that little length prefix, which should be the total length, and then we check zeros afterwards. So if you make any modification to either the ciphertext or the key, it's going to unauthenticate, or it's going to unencrypt it to garbage. And then when we pull out that length prefix, we get this invalid padding on input. So either the bit flipped in storage and STD changed something, or a key change. And I'm going to guess that somebody regenerating a key accidentally is more likely. However, I don't know.
Yeah. Is that message in a place that we could improve the feedback? Like, if the transform fails with this error on a, like, does that just mean that the key is bad? Like, should we give a better error?
Yeah.
Use an authenticated container.
Yeah, that's another option. But it still doesn't tell you whether it's a key that changed to the ciphertext.
Yeah.
So should I take support off? Change it back to improved error message or something?
Yeah, like usability or something, and probably backlog, and who is looking at like KMS encryption stuff? Is that Alex or?
Maybe Shihong.
Okay.
But the org. Hand it over to Alex for now.
Okay.
We did have that one issue where bits were being flipped in STD that was causing corruption of the kind or somewhere. We don't know if it was STD. Do you remember that?
Yep. In my nightmare.
Caused by a.
The most probable explanation is that the key was changed. So I would probably limit this discussion to that.
Yeah, that's.
There is an issue open for the bit flip. issue as well.
Will never be close. All right. Namespace creation, deletion, automation. So what were you saying about support? Or you were saying that Diverge can add a triage label X?
Yeah, Contrib-X is working on a triage workflow that should simplify our queries and just make it us to have one query. It's sig-auth needs triage or something like that.
Oh, we don't have a can support label. We were. Do we now ensure support or redirect?
I don't know.
We used to send to Stack Overflow, but I think that changed at one point. I'm gonna leave those for now.
Okay.
Onto some more substantial ones. Node authorizer fails to authorize right after QBO server starts. Just a bug. Oh, yeah. I know where this is coming from. We see a bunch of fall throughs on to the subject access review webhook when the node authorizer is loading. One option is to wait. Not sure if that's a good option.
I mean, we have the same issue with RBAC too, right? Like while the RBAC caches are loading, it says no opinion and falls through. You can assign me to that, and looks like Matt and Wojtek were already on it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Need to think about what we want to do there. So it sounded like the discussion was kind of going in two directions. One was indicating readiness, or like factoring authorizer readiness into the API server readiness signal, which could maybe help you if you have a multi API server cluster, like wait to bring one into rotation until its authorizers are happy. But if you only have one, that's not going to help you. So then the question is, like, do we want to change what the authorizers do when they're in that state? Either make them, well, I don't know, like make them wait or make them reject instead of no opinion, or I don't know. So we'll think carefully about that.
No opinion is kind of a rough opinion to have. It's like, application, I'm supposed to be the expert, but figure it out.
Yeah.
That's the
from the application's perspective, rejecting looks the same as everything in the chain having no opinion. So, like, I guess the question is, like, what do we want the behavior to be from the application's perspective? Do you want to wait? That could be bad. If we're talking like a couple seconds for it to be ready, then that's maybe okay. But we don't know if it's just going to be a couple seconds. We could wait for a little while. I don't know. There's some of the wait for a short period of time if we haven't synced yet seems maybe the most reasonable to me. But
you are already signed, Jordan, and we're out of time. So I think we did pretty well. Yeah, feel free to take a look at the rest offline. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'll see you all in 2 weeks.